Hello again, gang. Your old pal KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaigns. So today's video is a follow-up on last week's, in which I talked about using dragons in your campaign. Last week I went over the historical and literary antecedents of dragons and how they evolved in terms of the different rule systems of D&D. So today I'm going to offer up some suggestions about how you should use dragons in your own homebrewed world, thinking about how they fit into the social and ecological framework of your world. I'm going to divide those, the chromatic and the metallic dragons, what people or humanoids or sentient creatures think about those dragons and vice versa, and what the dragons think about each other, how they interact, and also how many dragons you should have. And also Dragonborn, if you're using that race, what is their relationship to dragons? Is it special? Is it based on the color? That sort of thing. Which, that's a lot to cover, so I guess I better get going. All right, so a point of order right at the outset. I'm going to be using the dragon stats and descriptions as given in the Monster Manual 5th edition. Even though I'm homebrewed world, I don't homebrew the stats as much, especially in this discussion. Part of that is it's hard enough coming up with your own world and civilizations and mysteries and whatnot without having to develop and potentially play test a whole bunch of dragon stats. Because believe me, whatever you think of the challenge ratings and this or that, they play tested these monsters. And I also think, having created, many worlds and different things over the years, it can sometimes be easier for your imagination if you've got a framework to start with. Think about if you see a dungeon online. You take that dungeon and you just repurpose it, right? Well, you're looking at the various hallways and rooms and whatnot, and you're thinking, well, who would use this and why? And it spurs your imagination. So take the dragons as they're given in the books, and then think about how they might interact with each other, the world, etc. All right, so the first thing you want to think about when you're integrating dragons into the ecological and social framework of your world is that they have actuality. Unlike historical dragons or dragons in a book, these are supposed to live in the world, and they also live within the framework of a set of rules in which player characters, real human beings, are interacting with them. So you want to take the stats of the dragon and think about how that impacts their actual existence in the world. So what do we know about dragons? Well, they range in age from wormling to agent, in size from medium to gargantuan. They can fly. They live a very long time. They range in intelligence from average to extremely highly intelligent. They have a breath weapon, which can be very deadly. They have this awe, fear ability. They have legendary actions and lair actions. They are also divided into two groups. The chromatic dragons are the evil dragons. The metallic dragons are the good dragons. And the metallic dragons have this special shape change ability, and they have two types of breaths. One is very deadly, and one is more of a subdual, either sleep or push away type thing. And of course, there is a variant in the book that you can give dragons spell-like abilities, much like in the older editions. But in this case, I'm not going to go with the variant. I'm just going to think about dragons as they're given the basic monster manual. All right, so when considering dragons and how they're interacting, I am going to ignore the wormling for this discussion. It's only up to 5 years, which something that lasts, lives 800 to 1,000 years. Those 5 years are nothing. I just suspect wormlings are going to keep out of sight of most creatures. You can have a thing where, and they talk about this with the metallic dragons, and they take care, they have family units or whatever. Let's not talk about the wormlings. I am going to talk about young dragons later in the discussion in terms of their behaviors and whatnot. So really the size that you're going to be considering for dragons is large to gargantuan. And presumably a dragon flies around to catch prey or simply to patrol its home range or whatever, which means that people, sentient creatures, humanoids, monsters, whatever, are going to see it. And if you're just walking along and suddenly you look up, oh, damn, dragon flies overhead. That's not like a crow or, a dragon. Oh my God. Because the thing is, dragons have renown. They may be feared, they may be worshipped or revered. The one thing they are not is ignored. So people have this reaction to dragons. These are powerful creatures to be feared. What do the dragons think about the humanoids they see below them scrambling around? Merely as a food item or something to exploit or something to ignore depending on their activities? So generally speaking, I feel like chromatic dragons have contempt for not merely humanoids or basically any sentient creature, any undragon-like creature, whereas the metallic dragons seem to have a curiosity and interest in sentient creatures, humanoids, unless they're evil. Chromatic dragons will use humanoids and creatures as servants or spies, to worship them. Obviously, the kobold is the classic example, but there are other evil humanoids or creatures that may serve these dragons as well. The metallic dragons seem to interact. Obviously, gold dragons are very aloof. Silver dragons, on the other hand, are very talkative, but they don't seem to employ people as much. They seem to be much more the sort of benevolent loners. So you also might have a community which lives in the area that a dragon lives that keeps it at bay by giving an offering to that dragon, whether it's once a year, twice a year, whatever. That offering could be treasure, gold, gems. It could be livestock. It could even be a human sacrifice. But the point is, the dragon allows them to stay there so long as they continue to produce for that dragon. If he wipes them out, that's a one-time only thing. Now, the thing about that is that community has to have a very good reason to stay there. Maybe there's a mine that they've discovered or something such that it's worthwhile for them to make this offering. Now, if you get into the human sacrifice thing, now you're talking about maybe a neutral to evil community and something the player characters may be interested in stopping. Think about ways in which dragons can use humanoids or whatever to their advantage. They have their areas we'll talk about, but anything within that or even just outside of that, they're always scheming, they're always thinking about how can I use this, and they're trying not to bring down the wrath, of people collecting together if they are just literally killing everything. All right, so when you think about a dragon and its lair, what is the range or the sphere of its influence? And obviously, this is extended because dragons can fly. Now, there's all sorts of stuff on the internet about, how far a dragon can fly per day and how far it would go each day or whatnot. If you look at the basic movement rates, 80 feet a turn, you calculate that out. They say that creatures can fly up to 9 hours a day, so that's 72 miles. Now, what we used to say was, especially the chromatic dragons, they're very, secretive, jealous. They're worried about their lair. We used to say they don't go outside a day's range of their lair if they can help it. They always want to go out and do whatever they do and then fly back and be in their lair to prevent things from getting stolen. So if you have a 72 mile range, then that means 36 miles out, 36 miles back. And within that 36 mile radius, that dragon would be patrolling, to make sure this is my area. I don't want, certainly any other dragons, but any other powerful creatures. Everything within this radius is the sphere of my domain. So here again is the advantage for dragons of staying near one's lair. You've got your legendary actions and your lair and regional effects that protect you. So especially the chromatic dragons that don't want to lose their treasure, they're always worried and paranoid about something coming after them. They're going to stick around their area. Even though they could, in fact, range far afield, they don't want to leave the protective area of their lair behind. Now, the metallic dragons, as always, are a little more mysterious in terms of their aims. They do say that within their lairs, which they protect, they, instead of being just, treasure hoards or whatever, they are avid collectors of, artworks, antiquities, this sort of thing, which they do guard jealously, but not with the same avariciousness as the chromatic dragons. And I think this is related to them having the shape change ability because they're not as trapped in their lair. They're not constantly paranoid. They have it protected. They do wander out to interact with humanoids and people that they're so curious about. You could, in theory, run into a metallic dragon anywhere, not necessarily within the range of its lair or, necessarily in its lair. All right, so when you think about a dragon's lair going out and back and forth, you might get into a discussion of, well, how do they support themselves, these giant creatures? What do they have to eat? And you can find all sorts of posts that talk about not only how much a dragon would eat, but sort of alternatives. They can, get the fungi off of rocks, or they go out over the ocean and they spot a whale and they grab it and take it back, or, all sorts of things. Here's the thing that I think about. A dragon is a magical creature. The little wings on its back could not support it to have flight, and certainly the breath weapon is not natural. So even though dragons obviously do eat, even though, again, you can have the villagers making an offering of livestock or whatever, or have them raid something, I would not worry about the dragons. Like, how are they eating? What do they eat here? The only thing I like about this As reptiles, you think of a crocodile. When it makes a big kill, it goes into its lair and it has to sit literally still. It goes into kind of a stasis as it digests its food. So you could revive the old sleep rules for dragons in this sense. But worrying about whether the, terrain is going to support a dragon, you know what? It's a game. They get food. So what does it mean that dragons live for so long? As they say, easily 1,000 years for an ancient dragon. Well, the one thing is, a 1,000-year-old dragon knows its territory very well and has probably been around on its travels, if as a younger dragon, which is, up to 100 years, or even as an adult, maybe it traveled around before it settled into a lair. It knows a lot of things about the world. The higher level dragons have good memories. The metallic dragons are described as having especially good memories. So they know a lot about the world. And they know a lot about each other, right? Because the dragons, their number one opponent in the world are other dragons. The chromatic dragons hate each other, and they hate the metallic dragons 10 times as much. And you have the gold dragon and bronze dragon described in the book as being, very much wanting to wipe out evil. Its brethren, the chromatic dragons, are evil number one. So they would remember each other. They would have knowledge about this. But the other two things that age can give you, which are often at cross purposes, is wisdom and spite. So even the lowliest of the dragon, the white dragon, which is described as animalistic, may, as an ancient white dragon, have gained some insight into the world with all that time, may have more of a sense of how to maneuver in the world without merely attacking everything in sight. But it may also, after all these years, have become acutely conscious of its low status in the hierarchy of dragons and become very bitter about this. Oftentimes, when you get to a certain age, you're nearing the end, people can become bitter about, look how my life turned out. And for a white dragon, let's say an ancient dragon, or anything, this bitterness can be projected onto outsiders who come into its area. And I think you could use this intense antipathy of dragons to explain why they haven't, taken over more of the world. Now, this might be related to, as they describe in one paragraph in the description of the dragons, that Tiamat, the evil dragon deity, in her constant struggle with Bahamut, the platinum dragon. Okay, but on the ground, how would this have an effect? I think it might have an effect of actually controlling the amount of dominance that dragons are having in the world, because they're always competing with one another. Because on the ground you have, much to lose if you have a battle, not necessarily much to gain. And so there develops maybe a sort of unspoken truce between dragons, and maybe it's their surrogates that they employ to peck away at one another. Again, if a dragon has a chance, red dragon has a chance to defeat a gold dragon, it's going to do that. But how often is that going to happen? All right, so you're setting up your dragons, you're thinking about their interaction, how they, humanoids and races of the world, how they interact, what the dragons think about them, each other. What about the Dragonborn? If you're going to use that race in the game, obviously they are derived in the origin story is they started off as egg hatchlings of dragons, a specific race. It doesn't go in too much, they have these clan structure and everything, how they're born or whatever today. But, what's the story? If you have a Dragonborn lawful good cleric who is of the blue dragon lineage, what does a blue dragon think about that? Or vice versa, super evil Dragonborn that is of gold dragon, lineage. Wouldn't the gold dragon not like that? And here again, if you're playing the game and you're going to give an advantage to a Dragonborn in terms of its lineage, in terms of dealing with a dragon of its lineage, do you give it a tremendous disadvantage? Opposite. But what I think and play is that even though dragons recognize the ancestry of the Dragonborn, even if it's related to them, but I think more than that, they associate them with lowly humanoids, not really worthy of their attention, not worthy of their antipathy or affection, because dragons feel themselves inherently superior to all creatures, much less, humanoids. The other thing this does is it doesn't give this advantage, disadvantage, it doesn't add a wrinkle that could be a pain in the ass to Dragonborn. Young dragons, that 5 to 100, I think you can have some fun having them interact with the players, because they don't have the maturity yet, potentially, to understand the implications of messing with people. There's a story of this game park in Africa where poachers had killed off all the older adult male elephants, And so the young elephants, sort of adolescents, went on a rampage. They were attacking things. They were attacking rhinos and hippos and each other. And the rhinos were goring them. And it was a total mess. And the park rangers finally went to another park. And they got a bull elephant. And they took it over by helicopter. And they put it in the game park. And this bull elephant quickly got all the adolescents in line. Because they didn't understand how to conserve their attacks. They weren't mature. Well, why can't young dragons be immature as well? Because not only will young dragons be easier for your players to deal with their first sort of exposure to dragons, but younger metallic dragons may be more interested in sort of interacting. Think of a young silver dragon. They're always interested in people. It doesn't know that much about people. It's interested. It may shape change, be with the players, be an NPC, hiding its true ability, or it could present itself as a young silver dragon. This also provides information to the players about the social structure of the dragons in your world. Who are the big shots? Where do they live? This sort of thing. So another interesting thing to consider is how many dragons are you going to have in your world? And, it's maybe seem like a strange question, but should you think about an ancient dragon, its area of influence, its renown, everyone is going to hear about this. Do you want to have them, every 50 miles in your wilderness? And this relates back to the historical and literary tradition of dragons. Think of the Hobbit, Smaug's the last dragon in Game of Thrones. There's only 3 left. Versus something like Earthsea Trilogy, where there are not a ton, but there's quite a few dragons. Or the Dragon Riders of Pern, where, they're everywhere. I think you should limit the number of dragons. They're very powerful. You can come up with reasons, they lay eggs very rarely, or they're just not common in the material plane, whatever. Make, 5 or 6 ancient dragons, know where they are, know where your adult dragons are. As I said, you can use the young dragons as a sort of introduction. Because the thing is, you're not writing a novel or something where you can just have dragons running around and it doesn't really matter. You're coming up with the plot, whatever. Your players are creating the storyline, and these dragons are interacting with your world as a real thing. And if there's too many of them or whatever, it becomes impractical that they would just, be there and not fighting with one another or whatever. If you had a ton of dragons, there's an old saying that when elephants fight, the grass suffers. Massive dragon wars would cause everyone else to suffer. So I wouldn't have a world where there's no dragons, even though I had a viewer, Lauge Christofferson, who explained that he, in a encounter his players had with a Dragonborn shaman, the shaman said, all the dragons died. And they were like, really? They did? And he decided to double down on this and say, yes, they've all died. Now, I said in my note back, well, first of all, the shaman could be lying, he could be wrong, or even if he's right, there might be somewhere in some cave, a cache of dragon eggs that only needs X, Y, or Z that the players could provide to be, hatched or whatever. Because dragons are such a iconic creature that I think you should have some, but I don't think you should have too many. And another reader, Frederick Schmidt, said, I got 6 dragons in my world. They are the gods. Now, I don't know if he was sort of being tongue-in-cheek, but certainly dragons are very powerful. They are worshipped by all sorts of creatures, so I can understand that. Because people are going to know about these dragons. They're going to know where they live. They're going to be very conscious of them. They're going to know where their lairs are, and probably they're going to avoid those areas. So what I think you should do, once you've got your map of your homebrewed world, look at the areas where it makes sense geographically to have some ancient or adult dragons. Think up, so a swamp is logical for black, a forest for green, mountains for red. Obviously, if you have a polar area for white, and obviously brass dragons and blue are situated in deserts, and then the metallic dragons, you have some coastal ones and whatnot. But you don't need to create all the different types right away. You can if you want, but create, maybe 2 or 3 on each side, ancient dragons, name them, think about a history, and then think about their sphere of influence. So if you have a green dragon in a forest, how has it influenced that forest? Does anyone live? What do the creatures do there? Obviously, they are portrayed as, especially evil and conniving and whatnot. So do they just drive out all the sentient humans? And of course, all these ancient dragons are going to know each other. They're 800 plus years old. They've all been interacting. They know where the other ancient dragons are, and they're competing with one another. Then you want to come up with some young dragons that the players might encounter. let's say that a green dragon has entered an area of woods and it's trying to set up a lair, or it's just harassing the elves there, and the players find out about this, and there has to come help, get rid of this green dragon. So once you've got your, 3 or 4 ancient dragons, then you just think up some large dragons, and this maybe you're going to just double that number, put them, away from the ancient ones. These are going to be more towards where the players might interact or whatnot. And again, each of these dragons are going to have an area of influence, the communities or whatever they are, because even outside, let's say you decide on that range I talked about, 36 in all directions of radius, outside of that, they might have some influence. They could certainly take an extra time, maybe just fly extra or even leave their lair that one day or whatever. They could also have agents around them that go out into these areas to influence things. All right, so there's some ideas on integrating dragons into your world. If you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Please leave some comments. I love to get them, and I always answer them. But most importantly, my friends, keep playing D&D and tell somebody else about it.